Welcome to episode 139 of the XS Noize Podcast. I'm Marc Millar. Thanks for listening. In this episode, I speak to legendary music manager Simon Napier-Bell about his latest documentary, George Michael, Portrait of an Artist. If you missed the previous episode, I spoke to XTC's Andy Partridge, Jan Olive and Stu Rowe about their new project, The Three Clubmen. So check it out, and if you like the podcast, please subscribe on your favourite listening platform, give us a rating, and leave a comment. Before we begin, here's what's been happening on XS Noize this week.
We have a packed review section this week with albums from PJ Harvey, Green Chatton and more. Ian Byrne gives the new PJ Harvey album 4 stars, saying it's truly wonderful and unique, benefiting even further from producer Flood's use of field recording and audio samples. Rather than tackle bigger issues, Harvey changes scale and focuses on one person, a wood and a village as the storyboard for Eye Inside the Old Year Dying, and Ian says it definitely works. Having led his band, Fontaines DC, on a meteoric rise, Green Chatton releases his debut solo album, Chaos for the Fly. Alex Hoggard gives 4 stars, saying Chatton's poetic lyrics lead to an intimate and honest record. There's new music streaming from Slowdive, David Gray, Charlotte Sands and Deacon Blue, and new tour dates from Foy Vance, Helmet, Depeche Mode and Rick Astley. Keep up to date at xsnoize.com.
Simon Napier-Bell is an English record producer, music manager, author and journalist. Simon has managed artists as diverse as the Yardbirds, Marc Bolan, Japan, Ultravox, Wham and many more. In this interview, Simon talks about managing Wham in the 80s, organising their concert in China, turning down the Pet Shop Boys, and we go in depth about his brilliant new documentary, George Michael, Portrait of an Artist. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the XS Noize Podcast with Simon Napier-Bell. Hi Simon, welcome to the XS Noize Podcast.
Great to be here. I've heard a lot about it, so it's good to actually be in the presence of the XS Noize itself.
Likewise, it's great to be in the presence of the legendary Simon Napier-Bell. such a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you.
I watched your documentary, The Real George Michael, Portrait of an Artist.
Right.
Really enjoyed it. Absolutely fantastic documentary. But before we get into that, I want to know about you. I want to know, can you remember the first band or artist that made you pay attention to music?
Well, it would have been jazz, not rock. I mean, I was about 11 years old, and pop music was hideous. Pop music was things like, how much is that doggy in the window? And I'd known you were coming out of baked a cake, and I just thought pop music was the worst thing in the world. And then I heard jazz. So what was the first jazz I heard? Well, what happened is my brother was given a trumpet for Christmas when he was 10 years old, and he didn't persevere with it. So 3 months later, he gave it to me, and I decided I'd learn it. And then what inspired me to learn the trumpet was I started listening to trumpet players, I guess Louis Armstrong, or there were English trad bands at the time. So those would be the bands. I think Chris Barber's band probably was the English trad jazz band I listened to and liked the most. So that doesn't really count for what you're talking about. So move forwards. I became a professional musician. I went off to America. I thought I was going to become a world famous jazz musician. Then I found out that you didn't make your money from jazz. You had to go and get a job. And that meant playing in a nightclub or a pub or a bar. And that meant playing pop songs. And I hadn't listened to a pop song since I discovered jazz when I was 11. So at the age of 18, I suddenly had to listen to all the current pop songs because I had to play them. And what do you know? They were fantastic. All that dreadful pop which turned me onto jazz had gone. And I started hearing these songs which were created at real artistry and fantastic musicians. Things had changed totally. I mean, whether you're talking about a great well-composed song like Come Fly With Me of Frank Sinatra, whether you're talking Blueberry Hill with Fats Domino, we were talking about pop music which really had appeal and interest to somebody who was musical, which it didn't have when I was 11 years old. So then I became a pop fan. And rock and roll, yeah, that too, but less rock and roll and more pop. And then bit by bit, I began to listen to not rock and roll, but rhythm and blues. And then eventually, quite a bit down the line, I got into the music business in the UK and had to listen to rock music which I'd ignored until then. I became the manager of the Yardbirds. I'd really never listened to a rock record, only Top of the Pops. I mean, and as much as Top of the Pops included a lot of rock records. And when I realized I was going to manage the Yardbirds, I went home and listened to all their music. And that led me to listen to the music which they had listened to get influenced by. So it opened up a whole new world for me.
So has the music business always been a career path you wanted to follow, or did you have other ambitions growing up?
Well, I mean, when I started learning a trumpet, I mean, I fell in love with jazz and I wanted to be a great jazz musician. But I mean, I didn't, I read every book there was on jazz as well as learning to play the trumpet. I was a voracious reader. It never occurred to me I wanted to be in the business. I wanted to be a musician. But when I was 16, 17, I left school and got a job. And the job I got was band boy, which is the equivalent of a road manager, a tour manager. No, road manager, a junior roadie nowadays, with the Johnny Dankworth band, which is a big band, 22-piece band with a brass section and everything. And they played focused on jazz, but they were a dance band. They went around the country in a coach and they played gigs every night in dance halls. And sitting in that band bus, I mean, my job was to unpack the equipment, set it up, and pack it up again after the gig. But sitting in that band bus, listening to all those guys talk every day, made me fall in love with the music business. I mean, there was the gossip of what was going on and who was doing what. And I found that my real fascination sort of moved from the music to what went on behind the scenes in the music, which I already knew a bit about because I'd read all these books on jazz, you know. But I began to realize that was the fascination. It wasn't the music; it was the behind the scenes aspect of music. So from that moment on, I was open to the possibility of becoming something in the music business. I wouldn't say it was a career path because I first went into films. I was an assistant film editor, and my dad had been a documentary film director, so that was very much sort of in my blood to do that. But the problem with films is they take too long to make, they take too long to set up. If you make a bad one, you've just wasted a year of your life. If you go in the recording studio and make a bad record, you've wasted 3 hours. So as a young person, you know, the music business looked like the right thing to do.
Fast forward into the 80s. When did you first become aware of Wham, and what was your initial impression of the band?
I first became aware of them like so many other people. I turned on Top of the Pops one night and saw this absolutely incredible duo. Well, it was really 4 people because they had the 2 girls with them. Absolutely slay. I mean, that was their first Top of the Pops, the first time ever on television. And they played it like people who'd been doing it their entire lives. They were so good. And it was incredibly impressive. By then, I was a well-known manager. I'd managed the Yardbirds and Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page and Marc Bolan and Japan. But I just looked at them and thought, wow, I thought I wanted to give up management. But now I don't. And at that moment, I met a guy called Jazz Summers, who was also a manager who had a few hits with a group called Blue Zoo. And he wanted to work with me. And I said, why don't we chase after this group and get them? Because they're absolutely amazing. And we did. You know, we found out how to contact them. We contacted them. We found they didn't actually have a manager at the time. Their lawyer was looking after them, and he didn't know how to manage people. And we met them, and they were taken with us enough to say, okay, give it a go. That's it.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Jazz Summers. You know, he initially became to you. He came to you because he needed a mentor. He wanted to get into the management game. He didn't do too bad in the end, did he?
Well, no, Jazz was already a manager. He had this group called Blue Zoo, and they'd broken up after having one big hit. And my group, Japan, had just broken up after having 5 or 6 big hits. And we sort of commiserated with each other. And I don't think we didn't get on very well to begin with, but we went and had a lunch to be polite to each other. And then by the end of the lunch, we were getting on very well. And then we agreed we'd look for the right band. And we both agreed we didn't want to go to that initial stage of finding an unknown group and 2 years or 3 years trying to get them a first hit. And then if they don't, you've just wasted that money and time. So we wrote down a list of all the groups we thought were ready to move out of England to America, ones who'd had hits but hadn't become international. So there was Culture Club, there was Eurythmics and Wham, but we both put Wham top of the list. We'd seen them on Top of the Pops and thought they were fantastic. That was the group to get. And we got them. And then our very first meeting with them, George said, you've got 1 year to make us the biggest group in the world, which is just laughable. Biggest group in the world has to be the biggest group in America because that's 60% of the world market. And I said, I just burst out laughing. I said, George, you're crazy. But, there's this sort of arrogance about youth, which is really good, because by being like that, I mean, he pushed us hugely. And sure enough, 18 months later, they were the biggest group in the world. It was mainly because I pulled off that thing about getting him into China. But it was really impressive to meet George and Andrew. On Top of the Pops, they'd come across like twins almost, not lookalikes, but the way they behaved. There were two lads around town. They loved going dancing, pick up the girls, have a few drinks. But when they came to see us, I saw instantly that they were utterly different. The image you got when you looked at the group on Top of the Pops was Andrew, two Andrews. And of course, one was the real Andrew, one was George copying and learning how to behave that way because it wasn't his real nature. But the musical side came from George. And when they came to see us, you saw at once that George was really serious. He wasn't that happy-go-lucky guy you saw on stage. Who have you managed before? What are you going to do for us? You got 1 year to do it. Who's going to look after the money? Very serious. And I thought that was impressive. That was great. That means one group had within that group the two things you need most to succeed. Someone with a plan and real thought about it, and the other one who projected a wonderful image. So, I was impressed the first time I saw them, and I was impressed the first time I met them.
You just sort of skirted over the Beijing concert there. It was the first visit to China by a Western popular music act, and you were back and forth to China many times, having had many lunches and dinners. What was the biggest hurdle?
Well, look, I mean, we had this idea. This first meeting was over dinner, and George said, "We make us number one in a year," and I said, "It's impossible." And then Jazz over, the third or fourth bottle of wine. An impossible suggestion. Said, "Oh, maybe we could," almost sarcastically. He said, "Oh, maybe we could make you the first group ever to play in Communist China, first Western group ever to play in Communist China." And George said, "Yeah, okay, fix that." And ever the optimist, found myself a week later in China. And you couldn't even get a visa, so I had to get in illegally by paying somebody in a back alley in Hong Kong to introduce me to a friend at immigration who surreptitiously let me in. So I somehow got myself into China. And I sat there thinking, this is a totally communist, enclosed country, not the China you know today. There wasn't a single modern building in it. And who in this country could possibly give permission for a Western pop group to come and spread the subversive Western capitalist youth culture? Probably only one person, Deng Xiaoping, who was the president, probably the second or third most important person in the entire world. I was sitting there in a dingy hotel in China by myself, not knowing a word of Chinese, and actually illegally there. So if I went walking around, I'd probably get arrested. And now I had to meet Mr. Deng and say, "Excuse me, could my group come and play in China, please?" It took 18 months. I went every month for 18 months and slowly managed to meet and work myself up a tree of politicians and people who could finally get me to the right place. And that involved buying them lunch. So I went every month and bought everyone I could find lunch until I slowly crept up this tree from bottom to top.
Yeah, China was a masterstroke because of that show, as you said, Wham broke America, selling out stadiums, mission accomplished. It's what you set out to do. That must have been a great feeling when you actually were sitting there and you were watching the guys on stage in Beijing.
Well, there were the two great, but it's a great feeling to have pulled it off because it's impossible. It was utterly impossible. If I'd asked anybody, could you do this, whether they were political people or music business people, no, you're mad. So that was amazing to have pulled it off. And the minute they walked out on stage, they played in a stadium which normally has 14 to 16,000 people. It's a basketball stadium or whatever indoor sports stadium, and the front of the downstairs, which would normally hold 4,000 to 6,000 people seated, was empty of people, I think, to the audience, because it held 200 news crews, television, movie cameras, photographers, journalists. Every single news crew, every single television program in the world has sent a crew there. And so as soon as Wham walked out on the stage and I saw what was there at the front, I knew we'd pulled it off, because I wasn't there to try and break the Chinese market. I was there to try and help George get what he wanted, biggest group in the world in a year. And you saw those movie crews, you just knew it was going to happen. And sure enough, in America, they were on ABC, NBC, CBS News. 24/7 for a whole week, every hour on the news. And by the time they finished that week, there wasn't a person in America who didn't know them and loved them because they were so personable and nice. And they did lots of interviews. And sure enough, 6 weeks later, we were playing a stadium tour in America. 18 months after we met them, not 1 year. So we sort of failed. But since it should have taken 6 years, it was okay.
George's first solo single, Careless Whisper, reached #1 in 20 countries, including the UK and US. It's one of my favourite songs. In fact, I think it's probably the best song George ever wrote. What did you think when George played it to you for the first time?
One, I think everyone thought that. I mean, it was the melody, the song, the chorus, the lyric, Guilty Feet Have Got No Room. Everything about it just said this is a #1 record. And I think everyone he played, I wasn't the first person. They'd written it together when they were 17 years old on the bus coming home from school. And for 3 or 4 years, everyone who'd heard it said that's going to be a #1 record. And it wasn't a Wham type song. So we delayed it 4 or 5 records in before we put it out because it really wasn't what George and Andrew about image-wise. But we knew it was going to be a #1 song. I mean, it was perfectly obvious from the start. Whether it's the greatest song he ever wrote, I don't know. I actually think Last Christmas is a clever and equally well-constructed song. If you're talking pop songs, and if you're talking emotive, moody songs, there's a lot of others which came later, which are very good too. But I agree with you. It is one of the great classic. It's one of those songs of the modern era which rates with all the great songs of the past eras, whether you're talking Cole Porter or Rodgers and Hart. And, it's a song which rates with all the greatest songwriters there ever were.
And you mentioned Last Christmas. I think Last Christmas will be his longer lasting song because it's played every single Christmas.
It's an incredible, you walk around your supermarket or shopping centre Christmas and on it comes. And you've just heard Mariah Carey, bubbling out, and you get fed up with that. You say it's so professionally written to celebrate Christmas, Santa Claus down the chimney, stockings, Christmas pudding and all that. And on comes Last Christmas. There's hardly Christmas is almost casually mentioned. It could have been, Last Christmas I gave my heart. It could have been last week or yesterday evening. The song is not about Christmas. And it has all the Christmas sounds in it, but it's not about Christmas. And that's why it's so long lasting. It's a song about heartbreak and a teenage angst. It could have been a Carole King song. It's an extraordinary song and brilliantly constructed. As brilliantly constructed as Careless Whisper. Those are his two incredibly great pop songs. But if there's a triumvirate of songs, then the other one is Everything She Wants. And those are the 3 great songs he wrote. They weren't capped by what he did as a solo artist later. But he did, as you know, went on to have 5 #1s off the Faith album. None of those songs were as long-lasting or as great in terms of songwriting as those first 3. Later on, there were a couple more songs which came. I'm talking very strictly what is a great bit of songwriting. Because if you're a great artist, a lot of songs are going to be huge and be hits because of who you are and what you put into them and the way you project them and sell them and what people know about you and therefore can hear in the song which they wouldn't hear if they didn't know about you. But great songwriting, those 3 songs with Wham are amongst all the great songs ever written.
After you achieved all that success with the band, how did you feel when George and Andy told you they were splitting up? Did you think it was the right decision?
We always knew. I mean, from the first day. I mean, George knew. George was incredibly knowledgeable. He'd done nothing but study the music business since he was about 10 years old. It's just a recession. And it had absorbed his life totally since he was a child. And he planned how Wham would work. You'd put it together. You'd be a teenage group. Teenage groups should split up when they stop being teenage. Other groups go on and on, 10 years too long, and then they break up and they come back and reform, and you get 50 men on stage, and it's a boy group. That's not a boy group. It's an old men's group. He wanted it to finish when they stopped being teenagers. So he always planned, but he said it would be 3 albums in 4 years. And after 3 years and 2 albums, he said to us, I don't want to go on any longer. It's too difficult. It was a very false image for him. What I said earlier, that the image of Wham was Andrew and a little copycat Andrew, and George found that very difficult after a while. He really wanted to become himself, and you heard himself, his true self, more in Careless Whisper. And then the other solo record he put out during Wham, which was Different Corner, which was, it was extraordinary that Different Corner was such an emotional, inward-looking, introverted song full of angst and worry and things. And yet it was bookended by 2 Wham songs. So just before Different Corner, he'd done Freedom, which is an up and, bouncy song. And afterwards he did Edge of Heaven, which is equally big. It was astonishing, really, that he was able to continue to be Wham and still delve into himself like that in the middle of it and then come back to be Wham again. But you could see where it was going. I mean, he wanted to use his music to go further into himself and to explore his ability as a writer and a creative artist more. And, for him, Wham had to come to an end. And once they'd had those 2 albums and become what he said, the biggest group in the world. He never said, I want to be the biggest group in the world and stay there for 5 years. He said, let's get to that target. And his idea was, once I get there, then I step off that as a platform and I go on upwards. And Andrew has agreed. I mean, Andrew's a thoroughly sensible guy. He knew that George had come to him as nothing. And one way or another, Andrew had brought out of him this extraordinary creativity and ability to perform. And Andrew was also a little bit tired of it. I mean, it's not an absolute pleasure being a superstar. I mean, you have no peace. You can go nowhere. You can't just go out for the evening. You can't go to a supermarket and buy something or sit down in a restaurant without getting people coming over to you. Andrew had begun to have enough of it, and George had begun to want more. So it's pretty obvious they were amicably going to split up, which they did.
Yeah, and they split up at Wembley Stadium at the final show. It was their last ever show. When that show finished and it was all over, how did you feel that you would be managing the band again?
I didn't mind. I mean, the point was George was going to go on to something I didn't really want to do. I'm not that fond of being in America a lot. He saw America as the central part of his career. He wanted to, originally, his idea was, he was gay and he found it very difficult to live up to this sort of heterosexual image of what Wham was, the 2 lads around town. And he was probably right not to come out at that point. It would have killed Wham for no good reason. And he could, especially in America. And he just thought, I'll bring Wham to an end and then I got to be myself. But of course, what happened is he brought Wham to an end and then his desire to be a superstar overwhelmed his desire to be truthful and honest about himself. And he found himself putting it off a bit. I think I'll just wait till I've had a couple of hits with my solo career. And that went on for 2.5, 3 years with Faith, by which time he really couldn't stand it. And, Faith was, the tour, which went with that album, the tour was 21 months long. And for 21 months, he had 2 hours a day on stage and 22 hours completely alone, either in a limousine or in a hotel room or surrounded by bouncers, getting on a plane and off it again. He'd never done that before. He'd always had Andrew there laughing and joking, having fun. 21 months of solitary confinement and sort of faking who you are and not really being who you want to be, which is he wanted to be himself. And that was enough. And that's why he fell out with the record company after Faith and said he'd never make another video and generally challenged the record industry to let him work as he wanted to work rather than the way it normally makes their artists work.
Do you think that was a sensible decision? If you were managing him, what would you advise him to do then?
I'd advise him to come out before he started the tour. I would have, at the end of Wham, I'd have said, "Come on, be yourself." I mean, he was leading quite a gay life. He was going to clubs and getting off with people, and so it's a tremendously dangerous thing to do if you were going to try and pursue being not being yourself. But of course, once he started with Faith, America was such a target in his eyes. He really had to stop being gay. He just literally had to live a hermit's life by himself. And he found, well, anyone with a 21, that's not too easy. And he didn't enjoy it. I would have quarreled with him a lot more. I mean, we always talk very openly and genuinely to each other. I think his American managers dealt with him well, and probably had, in terms of friendship, a slightly bigger distance from him than I would have had. And I wasn't unhappy at all about not managing him. And all my life, the people I've enjoyed managing most are beginners who are going up. And once they get to a top place, they're not nearly as much fun to manage because your job is no longer to think of creative processes of getting them to the top. It's simply to smooth their passage every day. They don't really need the same sort of manager once they get to that level. They need an agent, they need a good accountant, and people to run things day by day. So a little bit different job. And I've always really enjoyed the creative end of management, which is taking a new artist and pushing them somewhere different.
Do you think it was a sensible decision when George decided to take on Sony in court?
No, that was a different matter. That was not anything to do with what we're just talking about, which was he found it so oppressive to be a superstar and constantly in videos, and everyone in it out front door knew who he was. Taking Sony on in court was a different matter. That was partly because he objected, as most artists do, to the fact that record companies own your copyright and run your life, and you pay to make the records, but they own them when you've made them. And the other thing is that he had heard that a senior executive at Sony had called me a limey faggot, and he just sort of said, it's outrageous. You have a 10-year contract with an artist. They can't leave you. And yet the people who are running your life and controlling your life in the record company can talk to you in those terms. That made him furious. They didn't fight the case on that basis. Perhaps they should have done. But that's what really made him angry. Wasn't a good decision. He was always going to lose the case because he'd made so much money, and he'd renegotiated the contract several times. So he couldn't say it was unfair because I was 18 when I signed it, because he'd re-signed it when he was 20 and 22 and 24. So, yeah, but at the same time, he had reasons for taking it on. He hadn't written for quite a while because his boyfriend had died and he was very upset. And it put him well in the public eye for a year, which without hit songs, he wasn't in the public eye. So as a star and as a person who's calculating his career, it wasn't a bad move. But whether he was going to win or not, I don't think anyone involved in the case thought he was going to win. Not certainly after the first day in court. As soon as you saw the judge's personal prejudice, because he was very quickly, he stated right at the beginning of the case, more or less what he was going to find at the end. You know, you've done very well, you've made lots of money, what have you got to complain about? That's sort of his attitude.
There's been lots of documentaries made about George over the years. Why did you decide to make the real George Michael documentary?
But all the other documentaries were so awful. That's why. You know, they all had one of those sort of rash commentaries. You say, and then George, and then George thought. I mean, what do they know what George thought? I hate documentaries like that, and that's why I gathered together a lot of people. We got 42 people. People who knew him, people who worked with him, people who cared for him, people of every type, but every one of them knew him really well. And we just got them to talk. I mean, I interviewed them and chatted, but I didn't really ask questions. So I just talked with them. And then, we had 40 hours of material and cut it down to 90 minutes. And there's no commentary. It is just these people talking, and they tell the story, intercut with George talking. There's a lot of archive material with George talking. So in some ways, it's a bit like a conversation between George and all these people. And that felt to me the right way to tell the story and get it honest. And I didn't talk in it because I know what I think and it wouldn't be interesting. For me, it wouldn't be. I didn't want to end up like those ones with the commentary where I'm saying, oh, and George did this, I know, believe me, because I was with him. No, I wanted the other people to talk. So I left myself out, and that made it much more interesting for me because I'm hearing what other people thought. And I learned a lot from it. I mean, it was really... it was enjoyable and interesting and quite educational. So that's why I did it.
Did you learn anything new about George from what they were saying?
Well, yeah, a lot. I mean, the one thing I learned, even though I'd been in the studio many times when he recorded, was amazed to learn that he never, ever, ever wrote down the lyrics to songs. I mean, he wrote songs in his head and went in the studio and sang that he'd go and make a backing track with the producer and then just sing lyrics straight onto the track without reading them off a piece of paper. They weren't right. He'd change them, sing slightly different. I'm sure he had them in his head. I mean, but, it's an extraordinary thing to be able to write lyrics and store them in your head like you'd write them on a bit of paper, and then sort of find the filing cabinet in your head and delve in and sort of read them off in your mind. Or maybe he didn't do that. Maybe he just remade them up each time. But that I didn't know that. And all the producers, we only had one producer in the film, but actually we talked to three, and they all said the same thing. it was just astonishing that George never came in the studio with a bit of paper. He just sang straight into the microphone. And it wasn't as if the words were finished. He was composing the song as he sang. But that I found out was amazing.
One part of the film that really annoys me is the interview with the Australian journalist. And he just comes straight out and he asked George, he said, "Are you gay?"
Well, it was meant to annoy you. I mean, it was a very annoying interview, a very annoying man. And I don't think anyone could look at it and other than hope that he didn't get much work after that. But unfortunately, he did. It was an extraordinary moment because it was so sort of vulgar the way he did it. I mean, vulgar in interviewing terms. It's not the way to approach an interview. Because potentially, if that is going to be his major question of the evening, he could have killed the interview. So, I mean, it's not a good interviewing technique. I'm all for building up to the key question, and the way to get the answer you want really is to get the confidence of the person you're interviewing to such a degree that they can't falsify the answer. And I think you can see in George's eyes at that moment that he cursed himself that he said no. I think the guy said, "Are you gay?" And George said no. And even as he said no, you can see him, should have said yes. It was the moment. He was halfway through the Faith Tour. He'd now established himself as, he'd had 2 number ones. He was a major artist everywhere in the world. Yes, he wanted to go on and be bigger. He wanted to be as big as Madonna or Michael Jackson. But he was actually desperate to come out and just let people know. And, I think if he just said, "Yeah, I am, so what?" the interviewer would have been completely floored. He wouldn't have known where to go. He was depending on George saying no to keep the interview going. And I think you can see it in George's eyes. He just realized he'd missed a trick. And then once he'd missed a trick, he wasn't going to go back and say yes. He wasn't going to get found out. He wasn't going to let the interviewer win. And so then he sort of justified it a bit, says none of your business anyway, and it makes no difference. But it was interesting too. And after that, there was a very interesting thing about Faith. It had 5 number ones in the United States. It wasn't very big in the UK. And when the Faith Tour came to the UK, it was sold out everywhere in the world. UK was the one place that it wasn't sold out. And there's something British people have, and I think Irish people have got it pretty good too. It's a good radars. But this is a British quality you got from us, so don't you claim it for yourselves. But we sort of see through people when they lie about their instinctive selves. I'm sure the Irish do that too, very well. Maybe we got it from the Irish, to tell the truth. Maybe we got it from the Irish, to tell the truth. But the fact is, when he did that Faith Tour, he's standing on stage and trying to get the girls to shout and scream and wriggling his butt. Most British people thought it was a bit of a joke because they instinctively knew he was gay. There was something about him which came over as gay. Americans didn't see it, but Americans are usually, not their whole show business is presented in a way which doesn't lead them to seeing through people. I mean, it's more of the audience subscribe to the act. That's part of show business in America. In UK, it's not. Besides which, we're far more used to seeing gay people. I mean, we're brought up on pantomime and things like that. It's not something which offends us at all. And it was interesting that later, I'm sorry, I'm jumping forwards, but later when he came out or was outed, that was the moment he became a super double-sized superstar in the rest of the world, and it killed the American market. So that was the moment when he really became the biggest star there was in the UK and most of the rest of Europe too. And so as America went down, the rest of the world went up.
When George did finally come out, he really used it to his advantage. He released the song Outside and took the piss out of the whole being caught in a toilet situation. And it didn't affect his popularity at all, really, in my opinion. But it was a masterstroke going, yeah, I did that.
Well, it was a masterstroke. I mean, I've got to be honest. I know George so well, and I know what a planner and a plotter he was. He once said to me, "I've never done anything I regret." And at the time he said it, which was during Wham days, I took it as meaning he was a super careful control freak, and he was very careful not to do things. Later, I realized I was completely wrong. What he meant was, anything I do, whatever trouble it gets into me, I'll find whatever trouble it gets me into, I'm going to find a way to turn it around and make it to my benefit. I'll never do anything I regret. That's actually how I live too. And I realized he was saying that to me as a mutual agreement to how to live, whereas I took it the other way around. But bit by bit, as I watched his life evolve over and over again, I saw him take huge risks on his career, on his personal life and other things, and always turn it around to his advantage. By the time he came out, everybody knew he was gay. I mean, even the media knew he was gay. Coming out isn't a one-off thing. I mean, he came out, as we know now from the Wham movie, which has just come out, he came out to Shirley and Pepsi and Andrew in Ibiza. Well, it wasn't Shirley and Pepsi, then it was Shirley and Dee and Andrew in Ibiza. And then some of his friends knew, and by the time he was caught in the toilet, he'd already had Anselmo as a boyfriend for a year, who had then died, and Anselmo has toured with him, so all the group knew, or the backing group knew, or the roadies knew. Probably by that stage, the only people who didn't know or hadn't been told were his parents and the media. But I bet his parents knew. I know after Anselmo died, he explains in the film how he sat down and finally wrote a letter to his mum and dad and said, I'm gay. And his mum was wonderful about it. And then, to his surprise, so was his dad. But I bet they always knew, because parents do know. And the media, of course they knew. What happened when the toilet incident came up was they were given the green light to talk about it. And in Britain, that was very well put by Dylan Jones, the editor of GQ. He said, there are moments when Brits, the communal British public, want to put their arm around somebody and say, it's okay, it doesn't matter. And they felt that about George. They didn't care. The week after that all happened, I was in a restaurant in South Kensington for lunch on Sunday, packed restaurant. And the restaurant was upstairs. Downstairs was a bar, and you went upstairs to the restaurant. And it was packed on a Sunday lunch. We were all sitting having a Sunday lunch, and suddenly George Michael walked up the stairs with a friend. And the entire audience, was what it became. The entire restaurant stood up and applauded him. And I thought, my God, that wouldn't have happened in America. They'd all mumbled and paid their bills and left. It was a wonderful indication of the difference between the UK and America. He turned it not just to his advantage in career-wise, but in every possible way. I mean, he was now open and happy. Happy is a difficult one, because we saw that he wasn't continually happy. But at that moment, I think for that next 3 or 4 weeks, he was very happy. I think that got rid of a lot of his angst, and he still wasn't over the fact Anselmo had died, even though he was living with Kenny, and he wasn't over the fact his mum had died, although that was 3 years earlier. But for a period, he looked happy. And we have a couple of people in the film saying, how wonderful it was, because one of the producers who worked with him, Johnny Douglas, said, thank God for that, because if he's not out, he comes to the studio, everyone's sort of talking in this ridiculous, pretending he's gay and everyone's talking that ridiculous, pretending he's straight talk. You see the girl on the TV last night, see her big tits and all that. And suddenly no one had to do that, and everything relaxed. So he turned it to his advantage, but I think he did that often with things. He would get himself in a mess and then say, now I got to get myself out of this and be better placed than I was before I did it.
George died at the age of 53 on Christmas in 2016 due to natural causes related to heart and liver disease. Where were you when you heard about George's death? How did you find out?
Well, it was Christmas Day, of course, and I was in Asia, so it was Christmas Day at dinner time, and I was sitting having a candlelit dinner with my partner, my boyfriend, of 30 years. In fact, I think we'd been together 30 years that night. New Year's Eve. So we were 5 days ahead of our 30 years anniversary. There I was on Christmas Eve having a candlelit dinner by the river in Sarawak, Borneo. So there's a one-up place to be at Christmas. And it was a very enjoyable dinner, and suddenly my phone started flashing and flashing and flashing. And I don't allow news to flash on my phone, but it was emails, and it was from journalists, mainly The Sun, The Mirror, all the tawdry journalists in Britain who wanted to interview me. And that's how I got the news. And, it spoilt my dinner, to tell the truth.
Following his death, many charities and people posted on social media about George's generous philanthropic acts and how he often donated his time and much of his wealth anonymously. Were you aware of how generous he was?
I knew some of it. I mean, look, when I managed Wham, he announced off the cuff one day, without consulting anybody else, all the royalties from Last Christmas are going to Ethiopia. In fact, it caused a slight problem because he's not able to donate all the royalties, and the royalties have to be divided up and split with the music publisher and with Andrew, who's a co-writer, and his management commissioner has to come up. And I pointed out that everyone might want them to go, but you do have to consult people. But it was a wonderful gesture because it meant that the number one record in the chart at the time, which was "Do They Know It's Christmas," which was made by Bob Geldof for all the money to go to Ethiopia, was going there, and now the number two, which had been kept from number one by Bob Geldof's record, was also sending everything to Ethiopia. So it's a fantastic thing, hugely generous. And then he did that miners charity, and Wham got laughed at for appearing at a miners charity concert. But it was absurd that they got laughed at. And there they were, a really big money-making popular group giving their time up for something, and most of the other people on the act were sort of left-wing, politically inclined performers. And but he didn't get laughed at by the miners. The miners loved that he was there. He was laughed at by the left-wing social media. The music business press in the 80s was a very political left-wing press. It's changed a lot now. But it went through a period of being more political than entertainment. And they all criticized Wham for doing it. But I thought it was fabulous that he did it. And then in terms of actual money, well, we learn in the film, and nobody knew at the time except very few people, that almost his biggest selling album, I think it was his biggest selling album, which was the Greatest Hits album, Ladies and Gentlemen, he donated the entire royalties from it to the Terence Higgins Trust, which was an AIDS charity. And Stephen Fry was the man who was told, that Stephen Fry had a dinner with him, with several people, David Gilmour and some other people. And he was trying to get them all to say they'd donate something to the Terence Higgins Trust. And then George suddenly said, well, I'd rather not give a check. Stephen Fry, heart sank a bit. Oh dear, he's not going to give us anything. Could I give you the royalties from my record hit? Sold it's 21 million, about 20 million pounds. Just like that, bang. And then, as you said, towards the end of his career, he'd always be sitting watching television. And anytime anybody wanted something, somebody would be talking about how his wife is ill and she needs an urgent operation and they can't pay for it to be private and they have to wait 6 months. And he'd get on the phone and say, just send her the money. But the condition he made with everybody was that you don't say it's me. He didn't want people to know. He just didn't want all that. It's quite a British thing, isn't it? In America, everybody, it's not really America, it's UK too, because everyone wants knighthoods, don't they? So they very overtly become heads of charities, and then a little bit later they get knighted or sent to the House of Lords. And George really didn't want that. He wanted to be charitable because he wanted to be charitable, not because he wanted something out of it.
Can you remember the last conversation you had with George?
It was just a music business conversation. There he was across the room at some event, the British, I don't know which, one of the awards events. And, you run across, you give him a hug. How are you? How is it going? Everything's great to see you. And then he's off saying that to somebody else. And I'm off to saying to somebody else. That's how the entertainment business is. Unfortunately, you don't get good conversations at those events. And that's the only time I ever got to see him. When you stop managing someone, it's a very interesting relationship management, because it's not a friendship, and it's also not a business. It's somewhere it sits in between. And the friendship is very close. And you may in a year have dinner 200 or 300 times together, quite possibly. But the friendship depends on the work you're doing, which is looking at the artist and how do you build a career and how do you make things go well for them. And when that's taken out of the equation, you find yourself sitting, talking to somebody which you don't know what to talk about, because that's always been what you talked about. And not many management artist relationships survive ceasing to be the manager in a friendship way. Not that they're unfriendly, just that was what held them together. And they never established any other basic rapport to being together. It's the same with a lot of the other people who worked with. You've got Chris Porter, who produced him, talking about, they were in Denmark together and shared a house for 5 months while he made an album. And every night they talked and talked and talked. It's like best friends. But then the album was finished and Chris was producing somebody else and George was doing something else. And that's how things go. It's very much how the entertainment business works. When you're working with somebody, it's like best friends. And when you're not, you'll be best friends again when you meet, but you're not phoning each other every night to talk. And I don't think I got a chance to talk to George really closely more than once in the 20 or so years after I stopped managing him, although I saw him quite often, a couple of times a year. I always said hello.
In the 80s, we had superstars like George, Michael Jackson, Prince, and Madonna. Do you think we'll ever see anyone like them again? Because they were such superstars. And certainly won't be selling as many records.
Well, probably not. And there's a good reason. The music business infrastructure worked in the days when records were what artists are the product. It's not really music, it's artists. And the music is the way they monetize themselves. That's what the public buy in order for the artist to make the money and have the status he does as an artist. And concert tickets, of course. But mainly in those days, it was records. And the only way a record company could justify the huge amounts of money to promote an artist to that top level was to sell millions and millions of records by them. And so the infrastructure of the music industry was when a new record was coming out by a major artist, millions were pressed ahead of time. And in America, for instance, put into 5 warehouses around the country, maybe a couple or 3 million in each of those warehouses. So 15 million records pressed ahead of time. You had to sell them. You didn't sell them, even though the artist was big. The records cost money to press and make and put out. They couldn't afford not to sell them. And so the record companies really needed to have huge, huge artists to sell that level of records. So let's suppose a record company had 10 major artists and they sold 10 million albums. It's 100 million albums. They had to keep selling that many albums on those artists. So they went on making each artist as big as possible. Now, nowadays, they could equally well have 100 artists selling just 1 million records each, and they'd make exactly the same amount of money. And it's less risk to spend the money needed to take an artist to the million selling level than it is to the 10 million selling album. So what's happened now is record companies prefer to have more artists selling less records, although the total number of records selling is the same. It lowers the risk. And with streaming, where you don't have to stock the warehouses, it takes away completely the awful investment of pressing 15 or 20 million records, which could possibly not sell. So they're not in the same position of having to make these double-sized superstar artists. So I think what we're seeing now, which is a lot more in number of slightly lesser artists, is where it will stay. And it's probably better for everybody. It gives more people a chance. The artists now in that mid-level are all making enough money to live incredibly well. They're all millionaires and they're touring and doing well. And they're less pressured. And the business itself becomes less pressured to keep somebody at that mad superstar level.
For anyone listening who doesn't know, you have been a record producer, music manager, author, journalist. You've managed artists such as diverse as the Yardbirds, Marc Bolan, Japan, Ultravox, and many more. You've had such an incredible career. Out of everything I've mentioned, what have you enjoyed the most?
Talking to Mark.
Well, that goes without saying.
I sometimes enjoy talking, sometimes less so, but it's not really. I don't like. A lot of people say, "What are you proud of?" Well, I'm not proud of anything. I mean, pride sort of doesn't come into what I do. I do what I'm committed to doing. I've got a big sense of responsibility. So if I meet an artist and I say, "I'll make you a star," I'm not really doing it for money. I'm doing it because I said I'd do it. I like to commit to something and then pull it off, and then I can say, "Now I'm free. I'll stop doing it." And I quite enjoy stop doing it too. My dad was a documentary film director, so I sort of deserted the film industry and went into music because it was quicker operating. And, a film took 3 years to set up and make and promote, and a record took 3 weeks. So you could be on doing something else. Young person, that's a much better industry to go into. But I always had in the back of my mind that I liked films more than anything else. So about 10 years ago, I came back to films, and I've been making full-length 90-minute documentary films ever since. But writing also was something I'd always intended to do, and I put that off till I was well into my 40s. So I like to have one book on the go all the time. They can take 2 years to write. So writing is a wonderful thing to have done. It's not enjoyable writing. I mean, it's very lonely, and you sit in a room alone thinking, "Why am I doing this? I could be out having fun." And it's a lot of pressure and commitment to keep going like that. But it's a wonderful thing to have written. There's nothing nicer than to have written that book and everyone's saying how good it is. But the actual writing isn't fun. Filmmaking is quite different. That is fun the whole time. It's social. I hear people say the same about directing theatre plays too. It's very social. You're involved with other people, which is nice. You get input from other people. It's a pleasure to go to work. It doesn't matter what pressures and difficulties there are. That's what work's about. That's fun. So filmmaking comes out first. It comes at the top in terms of sheer enjoyment as it's done. If you talk about satisfaction afterwards, perhaps book writing and perhaps artist management comes quite low down the list, because however brilliant you are as a manager, the artist will only happen as big or as successfully as he or she actually is. And so you can't really say, I did that. All you've done really is given them an infrastructure or an opportunity to become the artist which they were capable of becoming. So there's less satisfaction in the end about that. Although it can be sort of personally satisfying to achieve various peaks within it. It was very satisfying when I finally got Wham into China, having worked so hard to do it. But that's not really much to do with how big George was in the end. That's down to him. So that comes number 3, sadly enough, although it's the thing I've done most. But without that, I wouldn't have been able to have the subject to write the books about or the knowledge. And it's also led me back into films. So I see them as a mix. I don't look at my life as this is the best thing to do or that's the best thing to do. I like to do all the things which have to be done, and they all intertwine and help each other. And in the end, being sociable is the most pleasant thing. So even giving talks, I go and give talks, and sometimes I think it's a bit of a bore having to fly the other side of the world to talk to people for an hour, and they can be a bit oppressive and want to chat too much before and afterwards. But that is really what life's about. It's about mixing and communicating and enjoying other people and other people's company. So it's a mix of everything. Without the management, I'd have never got the other things, and without the other things, I wouldn't be getting the pleasure of mixing and creating with other people. So,
your new book, Love, Money and Luck: The Musical Managers, is being published next year. What can we expect from
it?
It
written yet. It isn't written yet, Mark. I haven't written one word of this book except a foreword, which I put. And then I thought, maybe I don't have to write this after all. But I will. Of course I will. The idea, and I haven't started, it will be started shortly, and it will be finished for next spring. But it's really looking at management and looking at all the great music managers, and maybe some of the bad ones too, and some of the ones who are considered bad, although they were great, because some of the managers who are very looked down on, people like Don Arden, who was a crook, frankly, and even Colonel Parker, because he was sort of rough and ready guy who learned his trade in the fairground, were brilliant managers in terms of breaking the artist. People denigrate Brian Epstein because he did a few poor deals, like with the merchandise, Beatles merchandise, but without his persistence and an absolute desire to make the group happen, they wouldn't have happened. Managers have a lot of different jobs to do, and some do some well and some do others well. Not many managers do all the jobs which management entails as well as each other. So it's a very interesting thing to write about. And I'm not writing about the artists, except when you have to show how they interact with management. It's about the managers. All the artists are driven by some sort of teenage angst, some sort of thing which happened in their childhood when they didn't get the love and attention they needed, and they reverted into themselves, became very introvert, went to their bedroom, stood in front of the mirror, imagined being somebody else who was loved and wanted, and then spend the rest of their life becoming that person who's loved and wanted, and walk out on stage and get from the audience what they didn't get at that key moment in their childhood. But I don't think any manager is without some element of that. They're not driven to the same stage as the artist. But without that, they wouldn't be able to tolerate the artist, because artists can be pretty intolerable and very demanding. And most ordinary people, when they meet and work with artists, find them difficult beyond the ability to cope. But managers don't. So I suspect that most of us managers have some element of that within us, but also a greater element of what I might call normality, of dealing with society at large, which most artists aren't very good at, unless it's structured for them, which is what the manager does. So I'm looking at that. So it's in that sense, it's quite a deep book, but of course it'd be full of fabulous anecdotes and fun. And most of the managers recognize that the only way you break an artist, despite the fact they're music artists, is with something visual. I can't think of one major artist ever who broke only on the basis of their music. nor only on the basis of their visual thing. This is a mistake some managers. They think, oh, if I have to do a fantastic gimmick and I make them look like this, we'll get a hit. No, you won't. You have to have a hit record, but the hit record has to have a hit image. And every major artist has those two things in conjunction. And usually that imagery is something which the manager helps with and promotes and is the more creative person of the two in dealing with.
If you could go back and relive one moment from your career, what would it be?
Wow. You know, these are personal things, aren't they? Well, when you get to the end of your life and you're sitting around with nothing to do thinking, what always comes to your mind is the person you nearly pulled and you didn't. And if you'd just done that, you would have done. And you can't remember any of the people you actually did pull. It's always the one you didn't quite, oh, why did I do that? So stupid. We're genetically programmed. What one person thinks about in that situation is what another person does. So I reckon that's what most people think about when they get older, that missed opportunities are what we think about, not the opportunities we took. And I don't think of any missed opportunities in business. You know, I'm not besotted with business or money making, but in personal life, you miss opportunities. You know, it could also, as an interviewer, you know, you'll go back and you'll think of the question you didn't ask at that moment when you could have done. You don't remember all the great questions you asked, which got you a great interview. It's that damn question you didn't ask, and that would have done it, you know. Missed opportunities, but you shouldn't, because it's a rubbish. Missed opportunities, they're lessons, they all teach you. So all the things you regret are the things actually which helped you the most. Yeah.
Is there a band or artist that you would love to have managed, but you just didn't get to?
You know, there are bands I loved, which I didn't manage. I mean, I love the Pet Shop Boys, still do. I think the Pet Shop Boys are an extraordinary, deep and complex band, which have been dismissed a lot as just being pop. They have a social intertwining, a social purpose greater than that. Now, I really like the Pet Shop Boys. And when Wham were making the video of Careless Whisper, or George was making the video of Careless Whisper in Miami, we had allowed 4 journalists to have passes and come along and do interviews. And one of them, one evening, came up to me and said, Simon, could I give you a tape of a group I'm in? And I got very angry. And I said, look, you're here as a licensed journalist. You're not here to be able to approach me and give me your stupid group. And I grabbed the cassette out of his hand and I threw it out the window, which actually, with the beach was below. So that's where it went, on the beach into the sea. And that was Neil Tennant of the Pet Shop Boys' first album. So perhaps I threw away the opportunity of managing the Pet Shop Boys. On the other hand, when you manage an artist, you don't listen to the music with the same distance, the same objectivity. So maybe if I'd managed them, I wouldn't have liked the music as much. So there's probably an advantage to that. And we stayed friends, which is nice. And if I'd managed him, perhaps we'd have fallen out. Who knows?
Well, that's me done. Simon, is there anything you would like to mention before we wrap up? Can you let the listeners know where to come watch the film, where it's accessible?
Well, look, it's different in every country. In the UK, it's Channel 4. Channel 4 streaming, you go to Channel 4 and it's free. You just put it on and watch it. In America, it's so many, and I haven't got the list. It's almost everywhere. But it's every view-on-demand channel for Amazon Prime, Roku. You just type the name in. But in America, the film is called The Real George Michael. And in the UK, it's called George Michael, Portrait of an Artist. But it's not available yet, unfortunately, in Germany and France and Italy. Coming soon, but not yet. Everywhere else, you're going to find it. Type in the name of the film, you'll find out where to stream it.